Think for a second about decisions concerning vaccines. Should a vaccine be released? Should it be, in fact, mandatory? It seems natural that the kind of question you would ask if you had to make that decision would have to do with the effects. If you release the vaccine, if the vaccine is distributed, how many people would be saved from serious illness or death? On the other hand, how many people are likely to experience unpleasant side effects as a result of the vaccine, and how unpleasant are the side effects likely to be? Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that reduces morality to those kinds of calculations. It was first formulated in the late 1700s, early 1800s by a philosopher and judge named Jeremy Bentham, and expanded upon further by a member of Parliament in Britain named John Stuart Mill. Now, Bentham and Mill were social reformers, and they had a lot of views that were considered radical at the time, and today we would think that they were fairly ahead of their time. Mill, for example, wrote a book on women's rights. Bentham argued that the point of imprisoning criminals was not that they should suffer, but simply that they should be separated from the rest of society and, if possible, rehabilitated. And it'll probably make sense when we start talking about utilitarianism how these philosophers could have come up with these ideas that were ahead of their time. It's a very practical theory, a very concrete theory, and one that's a little more natural to our modern ears than some of the other ethical theories. Bentham and Mill also claim retroactively an ancient Greek philosopher named Epicurus, who said some similar things, although he didn't put the term utilitarianism onto it, and maybe didn't have exactly a similar way of sort of formulating the ideas, but they do sort of retroactively claim him as a utilitarian. Now, the essential idea behind utilitarianism is that the best thing to do in any situation is to increase the amount of happiness that gets created and decrease the amount of suffering. And the idea is that you could sort of boil this down to a calculation. In fact, Bentham specifically outlined what he called a felicific calculus. Felicific meaning having to do with felicity, or felicity can be another word for happiness. And the way that the utilitarians understand happiness is that they think of it as pleasure and the absence of pain. Bentham put it this way, that humankind is under the governance of these two masters, pain and pleasure. And pleasure is what we want, pain is what we don't want. And all of our sort of calculations in life really boil down to these two kinds of experience. Bentham described his felicific calculus in terms of 7 aspects of pain and pleasure, including how intense the pain or pleasure was, how long the pleasure or pain was going to last, and some other factors that we won't go into in too much detail. Here's a modern take on the concept. You reduce everything down to 2 kinds of sort of units. A unit of pleasure, which you could call a hedon, and a unit of pain, you could call it a dolor. 1 unit of pain cancels out 1 unit of pleasure. And when you're considering what to do, what's the best choice, you sort of tally up the number of hedons, units of pleasure, that your action is likely to produce, and then you subtract any dolors that might be caused by your action. The utilitarians are quick to point out that we do this in our everyday life. You must be making decisions along lines something like this. When you decide what to eat for breakfast, for example, you decide if you're going to eat, you have some oatmeal or you have a bowl of chocolate, and you sort of add up how many hedons is it likely to cause if I eat the chocolate versus the oatmeal. Now, it's not just short-term pleasure that matters, otherwise you'd have a sort of strange, unwise calculus, right? You consider the long-term effects of what you're going to decide as well. So if I decide to eat a bowl of chocolate for breakfast in the morning, that might bring me more pleasure than eating oatmeal in the short term, but in terms of long-term effects, I'm gonna gain weight, I'm going to become unhealthy, and that's going to cause me pain and suffering and, maybe premature death. So, when I consider everything taken together, maybe it's going to be a better choice to eat the oatmeal. On the other hand, for someone else, maybe who just can't stand oatmeal, maybe there'd be another choice, maybe something not so unhealthy as chocolate, but that would taste a little bit better than oatmeal, and so they would choose to eat that for breakfast. Now that's doing a philosophic calculus on a personal scale. That's not an ethical decision, really. An ethical decision concerns pains and pleasures that I will experience as a result of my actions, but also any pains and pleasures that anyone else will experience as a result of my actions. So if my choices cause others to suffer, then I have to take that into consideration. If my choices increase the happiness of other people, then that counts in favor of doing that thing. So going back to the decision of whether to distribute a vaccine or not, a medical professional or a group of medical professionals obviously makes a decision like this, and they have predictions about how horrible the side effects are going to be. If there's a potential vaccine, it could prevent this disease, but it's going to have these horrible side effects, and more people there's going to be more suffering as a result of the side effects of the vaccine. Then they're not going to distribute the vaccine, right? On the other hand, if side effects are pretty minor and it's going to save people's lives, and make that decision to distribute the vaccine. Let's bring up an objection or just an issue with the theory that probably comes to mind right away. And you might ask, how do we know what brings pleasure or pain for other people? And that seems like a big problem sometimes if you focus on difficult cases like, do I know what kind of food my roommate's going to like, or something like that. On the other hand, when it comes to most ethical decisions, we're talking about serious cases where there's obviously a lot of suffering going to be caused from one outcome, or there's obviously going to be a great happiness going to result from another outcome. So you do have a pretty good idea what people like, what people don't like, especially when it comes to these kinds of cases. Just to give kind of an over-the-top example, let's say a baby carriage is rolling towards the roadway and cars are coming down the roadway. It's pretty obvious, isn't it, that if you just let that happen, that's going to cause more pain and suffering and emotional trauma for parents and family members, obviously, than just letting it happen, right? So, cases like this, you do know that certain things are going to cause suffering for people, and some of the things are going to bring people a lot of happiness. So those are the kind of cases that are involved in ethical decisions, and so it seems like this issue of, well, you never know what someone likes or doesn't like, that's not really the case when it comes to these kind of ethical decisions. Let's break the theory down a little bit further, because there are actually a few philosophical ideas that are kind of embedded here within utilitarianism. One is consequentialism. So if we ask what makes some action morally good or morally bad, it's the good or bad consequences of that action. You can see how that's motivated by the idea that what we like to see or don't like to see happen is what determines whether the person who did that thing did a good thing or a bad thing. Another aspect of utilitarianism is that it is what some philosophers call hedonist. Now, when you hear the word hedonism, it sometimes refers to a person who lives their life in pursuit of sort of personal pleasures, in particular physical pleasures. But in the case of a philosophical view, here hedonism means a couple of things. First and foremost, that the goodness or badness of an action is determined by whether it results in more pleasure or more pain, or a decrease in overall levels of pleasure. And there's also the idea embedded in this formulation of utilitarianism that happiness is defined in terms of pleasure and the absence of pain. So there's kind of two senses of calling it hedonist here. And the third philosophical feature of utilitarianism is that it's what some have called aggregative, that you add together the individual pleasures versus the individual pains that this action will cause in a number of different individuals, and you sort of sum all that together into an overall sort of pleasure or pain score for this action or decision. And there are other things we could think about in terms of the ideas embedded in this theory that allow for sort of parameters of modification or variation on the theory. For example, when we say that the consequences are what matter, is it the actual consequences of the act, or is it the consequences that were intended, or the consequences that were likely? Because if it's the actual consequences, then an issue arises which some have called the moral luck problem for a consequentialist view, at least one like we've been describing. For the classic utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, it is the actual consequences that they're concerned with. But the moral luck problem says that what if a person attempts to do an action that one would think would bring positive consequences, and it brings negative consequences instead, or vice versa. So imagine a man who decides he's going to poison his wife to death. And he decides his method of doing this will be he will use chemotherapy drugs. That because he's got a friend who's a doctor, he can get some chemotherapy drugs from his friend. And he's going to inject his wife with the chemotherapy drugs a little bit each night. He's got to be careful not to give her like a megadose, because then it'll be obvious. But if he gives her a little bit each night, and as you know probably, chemotherapy drugs essentially poison, and the hope is that it will kill the cancer when someone has cancer, but it won't kill the person. But if sometimes it results in the death of the person. So this guy decides, I'll give her these chemotherapy drugs each night. I can't give her too much, but just enough to kill her. And then afterwards, I can say, oh, well, she was taking chemotherapy drugs because she was paranoid about cancer. Right? Pretty evil, dastardly thing to do. But now suppose that it turns out, unbeknownst to this guy, his wife did have cancer. And the amount that he gave her was not quite enough to kill her, but it was enough to kill the cancer. Does that mean that he did a good deed? That seems ridiculous. Or, you can have a case of the reverse, where someone tries to do a good deed, and for some reason that they couldn't have foreseen it turns out to cause harm. I'm not sympathetic enough with the idea that it's the actual consequences that matter to give a very good defense of it, but I can tell you what Mill sort of says about it. He says, what we care about is the consequences. What we care about is that the good thing happens. And he gives this example of someone who saves a drowning person. If it turns out they did it because they were hoping to get a reward, it doesn't matter. I mean, all we care about is that the person didn't die. So who cares if the person had some ulterior motives? It doesn't matter. I guess Mill sort of has a point there that what matters to everyone, the drowning person's family and everything, is the actual result, that the person was saved. But it seems to me you can separate being happy about a certain result from seeing that person's action had a certain moral value. Another potential modification concerns whether to evaluate an action as a specific instance of an individual action, or whether to evaluate it as a kind of action that falls under a rule. And Bentham and Mill formulated what is now called act utilitarianism. In act utilitarianism, the consequences of a specific action are what matters. So notice how this act utilitarianism nicely accommodates the intuition you might have that different situations call for different measures. On the other hand, some later philosophers have advocated what's sometimes called rule utilitarianism. In that system, a rule, and we can think of a rule like not stealing, for example, is justified based on the consequences of the rule, because it would be better if everyone followed that rule than if people just ignored that rule. However, in a specific situation where the consequences of breaking the rule would be better than the consequences of following the rule, with rule utilitarianism, you still follow the rule. So the consequences matter in the justification of the rules, but not on the basis of each individual choice. And I want to point out here that the issue is not just that, well, we can never really be sure what the consequences of our actions will be and whether they'll be better or not, or whether it'd be better to steal in this scenario or not. Somebody who thought that might still be you could still be an act utilitarian, right? But you just have this extra view about limitations of human knowledge of consequences and whether they'd be good or bad. And so if we could only have the knowledge to evaluate each individual action, we would do that, but it's just a view that we can't. So that would still be act utilitarianism. But the so-called rule utilitarians say that even if it's a fact, if it's an established fact that in this case breaking the rule would be better, you still don't break the rule. Now, some philosophers have found rule utilitarianism problematic, and I think the ultimate reason is that it's hard to make sense of how it's really a form of utilitarianism. So start by thinking of imagine a scenario where the consequences of stealing would be better than the consequences of not stealing, but according to rule utilitarianism, the person still should not steal. Well, the issue is that happiness is not being maximized, first of all, and of course the rule utilitarian has to say they don't care if happiness is maximized. They're not committed to maximizing overall happiness. Instead, they have this thing about establishing a rule. So there's something a little bit weird about that, isn't there? And some even say that it's kind of contradictory. I mean, if you ask this rule utilitarian, so what's so great about this rule? Well, they say because if everyone follows the rule, then that will achieve more overall happiness than if they ignore the rule. But then they don't care about actually achieving maximal levels of happiness. So then why did they make such a big deal about the fact that the rule achieves greater level of happiness if everyone follows it? And even if there is a suitable answer to that question, there's an issue of categorizing theories correctly here. There's another kind of theory where rules themselves, moral principles themselves, have a kind of inherent logic to them, independently of what the consequences of following the rules are. In any case, I'll say once again that Bentham and Mill were act utilitarians. So now that we understand what the theory says, let's take a look at some pros and cons. One advantage of utilitarianism is that it's a concrete rule that offers a decision procedure. And since there's only one principle that everything boils down to, it eliminates conflict. So if you have a moral system where you have different rules, like say there's a rule you're not supposed to steal, but say there's another rule you're supposed to help people who are in need. Well, what if, the only way to help some people who are in need is to steal in order to, give them something? There's got to be some way to resolve that discrepancy, right? And utilitarianism offers one principle that you just boil everything down to the sort of is going to result in more happiness or less happiness, and you factor in, the pain you're causing, the suffering you're causing for the people you're stealing from, and balance that out with the suffering that you're eliminating. So it sort of ties everything up very nicely. Another advantage of utilitarianism is, as Mill points out and as Bentham pointed out, we definitely do this, right? I mean, it's definitely a concern at least, right? It's pretty clear, isn't it, that causing suffering is bad, right? Everybody knows pain is not a good thing. So it's at least a part of ethics. It's at least a part of doing the right thing that you reduce pain and increase happiness. And if you ask the historical utilitarians for a proof of this ethical system, their general response is that it's an axiomatic principle. It's something that's used to prove other things. It itself is not subject to proof. It's not the kind of thing that you can prove. And furthermore, it's like an obvious principle. So it's similar to like axioms in mathematics, like, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That's not something that gets proven in Euclidean geometry. It's an axiom upon which all other things are proven. Mill does offer something of an argument, even though he says it's not technically speaking a proof. He says if you want to prove something is desirable, then the only thing you can do is you can show that people desire it. And he makes the analogy, it's like if you want to prove something is visible, all you can say is that people see it. And then he adds to this the premise that each person desires their own happiness. So the happiness of each person is something that's desired, and so it's desirable, and so that would mean that the overall happiness is something that's desirable. Now, many philosophers have found this argument to be flawed. There's one criticism in particular that comes from a later philosopher called G.E. Moore, and the problem is that Mill seems to be kind of playing fast and loose with language here when he makes this argument, because he's playing on the meaning of desired versus desirable. So you prove that something is visible by showing that people see it, right? Because the word visible means that it's able to be seen. But does the word desirable mean that something is able to be desired? It seems like desirable, that's, even though it's right, desirable, if you pick apart the word, it seems like it would mean that's not how we use the word desirable. Something desirable is something, it would be a good thing if it happened, right? It doesn't mean it's able to be desired, right? Like, I mean, it's all kinds of things are able to be desired that we think would be terrible, right? I mean, somebody could desire it, but that doesn't mean that it is desirable. So the critique here is that, just pointing out that people desire this doesn't prove that it's desirable, doesn't prove that it is a good thing. And there's also a third issue that maybe you could worry about, whether this proves that the overall happiness is desirable. Each person desires their happiness. So the happiness of John is desirable and the happiness of Mike is desirable. But there's some question about, does that mean that you can say that the combined happiness of John and Mike is desirable? I mean, what if they're in conflict or something? I mean, I suppose if each one is like its own thing, and you accepted that this proves John's happiness is desirable and also Mike's happiness is desirable, then it does mean that the happiness of John and Mike together is desirable. If you assume that each of those is like its own separate thing that doesn't conflict with the other one. But there could potentially be issues there. Now, those are just criticisms of Mill's argument for utilitarianism. That in itself doesn't count as an argument against utilitarianism. So next, let's turn to arguments against it, arguments that say utilitarianism is actually wrong as a theory of what ethics is all about. One objection to utilitarianism led Mill to modify the theory significantly from Bentham's version. And I call it the swine objection, or the degradation objection. And the objection is that utilitarianism paints a picture of human life that's sort of degrading. The opponent looks at utilitarianism and says, you guys are saying human life is all about pleasure, just that's it. Something that's so kind of so lowbrow, so animalistic as pleasure, getting as much pleasure as possible. Are you saying that morality is about like people, like eating up like food that tastes good and shoveling it into their mouth and drinking things and I mean, what about things like drugs. Is it people doing drugs? That's, I suppose they that's pleasure, right? So life, the moral life, the good life, according to you guys, the utilitarians, is like, you know, eating and drinking and doing drugs and this sort of animalistic like existence, and that can't be what morality's about. That can't be what the highest thing that human beings are capable of, the highest kind of existence. Mill is concerned to respond to this kind of objection, and in doing so, he ends up modifying the theory. By general agreement, he kind of has his own version of utilitarianism that's different from Bentham's. Because on Bentham's understanding of utilitarianism, there's no superiority or inferiority between one person's taste of what's pleasant and another person. So if you enjoy these highfalutin thing, if you enjoy reading the great works of literature or conversing about philosophy, that's great for you. That's pleasure for you. If someone else just wants to, eat donuts all day, well, of course, if they eat donuts all day, like we said earlier, they'll get sick, and that'll lead to more pain. So there is that for even Bentham's version. But look, if they invented fat-free donuts that are not going to harm the person, and they that's what they want to do, is just live a life of like animalistic consumption, then that's fine for them according to Bentham. Just give each person as much pleasure that they can get out of life. But Mill is a little more concerned about this kind of objection. He's not okay with his theory implying that that's the best kind of life. And so he makes a distinction between two kinds of pleasure, and he insists that one kind is more valuable than the other kind. And the two kinds of pleasure, according to Mill, we could classify one as sort of physical pleasures, that's eating and drinking and doing drugs and sex and things like that. The other kind of pleasure we could call sort of mental type pleasures. The kind of pleasure that comes from reading a great novel or story, or enjoying art, or just simpler mental pleasures like conversations with friends, and friendship and social types of activities. And Mill argues that utilitarianism, at least his version of utilitarianism, is not recommending this kind of animalistic life. It's not saying that's what life's about, because the mental type pleasures are far more sort of valuable, far more worthy. And so the fact that they're kind of more important for human beings means that utilitarianism recommends and in fact requires a life that will be rich in those kinds of pleasures. Of course, he's not denying that physical pleasures are good. And, if somebody just has an objection that physical pleasures shouldn't be valued, I think Mill would just disagree with that. They're valuable too, but these mental type pleasures are more significant for human existence. And the way Mill put it has become rather famous. He says that it would be better to be a human being dissatisfied than to be a pig satisfied. And it would be better to be somebody like Socrates dissatisfied than to be a fool satisfied. Keep it in mind when considering these arguments. He's not just saying that too many of the physical pleasures will lead to problems or something like that. That's something Bentham could have said, you eat too many donuts, you're going to get overweight and so on. But Mill wants to say, even if they invent the perfect donut, it tastes amazing, but you're never going to get fat from it, and you could just live your life just gobbling donuts all day, and you'll be fine. It's still not a life that utilitarianism recommends. He wants to say that the mental pleasures are better. They're not just more efficient or healthier. They are better. according to Mill. It's also not that Mill thinks that physical pleasures just constitute like a lesser amount of pleasure than mental pleasures, because he specifically says no matter how much physical pleasure you add up, it can never be enough to outweigh mental pleasures and to be a reason to just neglect mental pleasures. Because otherwise, someone could say to Mill, well, if there was enough physical pleasure and it just adds up, that life full of only physical pleasures would be worth more than a life that also includes mental pleasures. And in fact, there's one example that someone gave where they say, like, suppose you have this like creature that's like an oyster. And this oyster is capable of like some level of pleasure, and let's say it's sort of physical pleasure on a very low level. But this oyster lives for like 1,000,000 years. And if you add up all the hedons of pleasure that oyster experiences over 1,000,000 years of its life, that means that it had a better life than a human being. So Mill explicitly says this is not just an issue of quantity, this is an issue of quality. Mental pleasures are better in quality, and no quantity of physical pleasures could make it worth abandoning the mental pleasures. And the first kind of argument that he makes, I call it the competent judges argument. It's an argument about who we should believe. It's an argument about testimony. He thinks that anybody who knows what they're talking about always agrees that mental pleasures are superior. And the only people that don't think so are people that are just like uneducated or otherwise incapable of experiencing mental pleasures. So think of it this way. Suppose we're going to ask two people which is better, and the two people are Homer Simpson and Lisa Simpson. So we're going to ask Homer, like, which is better, enjoying a good book or like eating a bunch of donuts, right? What do you think Homer's going to say? Reading books? That's not pleasure at all. On the other hand, you ask Lisa Simpson, which is better, she say, of course, going to the art museum and reading books is way more important than physical pleasure, right? So then the question becomes, like, who should you listen to here? Homer or Lisa? Well, first of all, I mean, Homer's just generally dumb. I wouldn't pay much attention to what Homer says about anything. And then, like, more specifically, in comparing these two kinds of pleasure, Homer's totally capable of physical pleasure, but he lacks the ability to appreciate mental pleasures, right? It's pretty clear that he thinks those things are not pleasures at all. He finds them boring and difficult because he just lacks the mental capacity. Now, when we turn to Lisa, it's not like she lacks the ability to appreciate the physical pleasures, right? She's human like anyone. So she's capable of both, and she says that the mental pleasures are more worthy, superior. So Mill would say we should listen to Lisa. And it doesn't matter how many people like that we can find and how many people like Homer we can find. It's not like the more people say one thing, the more it makes it true. People who don't know what they're talking about, their opinion counts for nothing, even if there were millions of people like Homer and only one person like Lisa. It still makes more sense to listen to Lisa. I think there's something suspicious about that argument somehow, right? It immediately strikes you as there's something sneaky going on here, even if you don't know exactly what it is. I mean, it sounds kind of elitist, right? Oh, Mill, the philosopher, the legislator, saying that the life of the intellectual is, a life like mine is, of course, superior, right? And the logical issue is that he might be making what's called a circular argument. Okay, so a circular argument essentially is an argument where you're supposed to be proving something, but you really assume that it's true in the course of proving it. If we're looking at these two pieces of testimony, and Mill says, well, we know Lisa's testimony is more reliable than Homer's testimony, we should throw his out. And if you ask, how do we know to throw Homer's testimony out? The answer is supposed to be, well, it's just that he's incapable of mental pleasures. And how do we know that he's incapable of mental pleasures? And the answer seems to be, well, because he says that they're worthless. And if he was capable of experiencing them, he'd say they're better. Well, that relies on assuming that they in fact are better, right? So if I've interpreted Mill's argument correctly here, it seems kind of circular. On the other hand, there may be a way to verify that some people have more capacity for mental type pleasures than others. Through maybe empirical psychology, like maybe IQ tests. And then maybe it does turn out that people who have higher IQs and higher EQs, they end up stating a preference for mental pleasures over physical pleasures. On the other hand, what if they don't? We shouldn't just assume that they would, that would be the result. And it seems like Mill has to be doing that because he doesn't have access to even the kind of IQ test that we have today. So there's an interesting issue to think about. I mean, what would you predict? If we can confirm, if we could ask people who have, verifiably higher mental capacities than others, do they prefer these types of mental pleasures to physical pleasures? Would they all say that they do? Or would most of them say that they would? I'm not really sure what the answer to that would be. So we would need that to evaluate Mill's argument here, really. Another argument that he makes is, I think of it as a trade-off argument, or just an argument about turning into a pig, right? He says, suppose you could be turned into a pig, and we could actually kind of think of this as some kind of magical proposition. He doesn't put it in these terms, but, let's say we got a wizard here in Dumbledore, and he's going to turn you into a pig. But once you get turned into a pig, you will have every pleasure that a pig could possibly desire. You will live the best life that a pig can possibly live. And we're assuming here that pigs don't have very much mental capacity. Nowadays, many animal scientists don't think that's really true. But let's say it is. So you'll have all the things that a pig is capable of enjoying, and that includes, a little food to shovel into your mouth, and mud to roll around in, other pigs to have sex with, and what else? You get massages, right? And you can verify that this is not a trick. They're not gonna slaughter you and eat you or anything like that. You will have the best life that a pig could have, but you'll be giving up your human life. Would you take that deal, right? And Mill thinks nobody's going to take that deal. I mean, almost nobody. If somebody said they would, I just almost don't believe them. So what does that prove? Why wouldn't you agree to a pig's life with maximal satisfaction? Mill thinks it must be because you value your human mental capacities over those physical capacities which you already have in common with the pig. So therefore, says Mill, the mental pleasures must be more important. And the idea seems to be that this kind of superiority is true throughout a spectrum of possibilities. Like if a human life is better than a pig's life, then a human life that's more filled with kind of these mental pleasures must be better than a human life that sort of neglects them. There are some possible criticisms here. One that comes to mind for me has to do with what economists call marginal returns. And the idea is that, like, if A being further along some spectrum than B makes A better than B, it doesn't always necessarily mean that C, which is even much further down that spectrum, is that much better than A. So one spectrum like that is things costing more. Like if an $8 dinner is more than twice as good as a $4 dinner, then it makes sense to buy that $8 dinner instead of the $4 dinner, like if you can. On the other hand, that doesn't necessarily mean that a $400 dinner is 400 times better than the $4 dinner. So at one point, like the spending more actually gets you more than the extra you're spending. But when you get to a certain point, like spending more is not getting you as much as what you're spending it on. And couldn't there be something like that going on with mental versus the physical, like pleasures? I mean, just because being a human is better than being a pig, it doesn't actually follow that, being the most intellectual type human, the human who is least concerned with the physical pleasures, necessarily is optimal. But I don't want to be totally unfair to Mill. It's debatable whether that's really what he's saying. He doesn't necessarily say that being the most cerebral, the most wrapped up in only the mental is the optimal way to go. After all, he does think that sensual or physical pleasures are worthwhile. But it's certainly an interesting kind of question, and I think it's debatable whether Mill is right about this whole idea that he's using to defend utilitarianism, that mental pleasures are like superior to physical pleasure. So one question is whether he's right that mental pleasures are superior so that utilitarianism could recommend them. But then there's this other question, which is like, does this actually rescue utilitarianism from this criticism? Because it seems like maybe it actually abandons utilitarianism. It's supposed to be a version of utilitarianism, but it's really not. Here's why. These two statements seem to be inconsistent. That is, that they're incoherent together. One, that terms like good, better, best are defined in terms of pleasure, or fully explained in terms of pleasure. And two, that some pleasures are better than others, right? Notice better than others. You can only say that some pleasures are better than others if you have some other kind of value in terms of which pleasure A can be better than pleasure B. Like A has to score higher on some kind of scale, and it can't be just a scale of like just involving a greater quantity of pleasure. Mill has already ruled that out. So the idea behind this objection is that it doesn't really make sense to say that there's just a difference in quality between two pleasures that makes one superior to the other, that makes one rank higher than the other. Ranking higher is a qualitative term, so it has to score higher on some kind of scale that has to do with some value, and that value, according to Mill, is not quantity of pleasure, so it's got to be quantity of something else that's valuable. So then this is not utilitarianism, because it doesn't boil everything down to just pleasure. Okay, so the swine objection generates this whole side conversation about kinds of pleasure and whether it makes sense to talk about non-qualitative superiority. But now let's talk about other objections, general objections to utilitarianism. Mill discusses several. I'll just pick a couple that I think are worthy of note. One is what some philosophers have called the no rest objection. According to utilitarianism, what you're supposed to do is to maximize happiness output that's a result of your actions. Well, if we think about what would be involved in doing this, I could usually make sacrifices myself that would lead to improved quality of life, overall happiness levels for other people. I can donate money to charity. I can spend my time helping others. And we normally regard those as good things to do. But now under utilitarianism, what you're supposed to do is maximize your happiness output. Well, that would require me to really spend all my time and basically my whole life making sacrifices myself in order to help other people. In fact, every sort of minute, every second of every day, I could think to myself, wait, I could be doing something that would help other people more than what I'm doing now. So I would get no break. I wouldn't be able to spend any time for myself, go and read a novel. No, I should be helping other people instead. Go and entertain myself. No, I should be helping other people instead. In fact, even when I go to sleep at night, up to a certain point, it's like, why am I spending this time sleeping? I should be out helping people. And so the idea is that utilitarianism ends up implying that we're all bad people for not spending every second of every day working towards the betterment of humankind in some self-sacrificing way. So first of all, Mill's response to this objection is that the implication isn't true, according to Mill. He says that utilitarianism is all about increasing happiness, and that includes your happiness. So you have to make time for enjoyments. You have to make time for rest. If you don't first of all, if you don't rest, you'll die, right? If you don't sleep at all, because you're spending every second trying to help others. Well, eventually you'll just die, and that won't help anyone at all, right? So you have to rest, and you have to try to be happy yourself, and do something to make other people happy. Now, let me just question whether Mill's response is really good enough, because it seems like he's underestimating the level at which self-sacrifice might increase happiness in others, thereby increasing the overall happiness. There might be a high level of sacrifice before we reach that point of diminishing returns where my sacrifice is not increasing the overall happiness. Like the point at which my sacrifice for myself actually subtracts from overall happiness might be pretty high. And so then it would be true that utilitarianism would require me to live this kind of Spartan life where I don't really engage in much pleasure for myself at all, much entertainment or just relaxation, because I'm most of the time trying to help others. I think it might have made more sense for Mill to take a different type of response and question, how can we be sure that that wouldn't be best? If utilitarianism seems to require that I sacrifice a great deal for the happiness of others at a level which I probably would be psychologically incapable of doing it, so what? Why does that mean it's wrong? Maybe that is the best life that I could live morally, but it's just that none of us can really attain that level of morality. I mean, the complaint here seems to turn out to be that utilitarianism sets a standard that's too high. Well, we have this common sense idea that it's kind of like, as long as I don't steal or cheat or harm others, I'm fine. Like I'm doing what's right. But if you think about it from a utilitarian perspective, it sort of makes sense that maybe it's not just all or nothing like that. Maybe it's not just like either you do these bad things or else you don't and you're fine. Maybe we could all do a little bit more for the world, a little bit more for the overall happiness. And there's just this super high standard that none of us can really, psychologically, we're incapable of meeting it, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be ideal if we did. So, this objection seems to rely on the assumption that it's obvious that morality doesn't require that much of us. And I don't think it is so obvious. Another kind of philosophical objection to utilitarianism is what some have called the publicity objection. And the publicity objection is an argument that utilitarianism is kind of what philosophers call self-effacing, or it kind of goes against itself in a certain way. It doesn't contradict itself, but it kind of goes against itself in the following way. Most, if not all people, operating under the assumptions of act utilitarianism and trying to calculate the maximal happiness for each thing that they do are likely to get it wrong for a number of reasons. They may just simply calculate the highest happiness result incorrectly. Like any skill, it's probably not like most people are not the best at doing it. So there's only going to be a few people who can really accurately calculate the highest potential happiness. And then the other thing is people will be inclined to kind of favor themselves and those near to them. And so they'll be inclined to kind of cheat on their utilitarian calculation in favor of themselves. Somebody is thinking about, oh, well, should I steal some money from the bank or not? And then they're likely to think about it in terms of like, well, I need this money a lot more than the bank does. And, they got tons of money and it's not going to really hurt anyone if I, steal like a couple $1,000,000. So maybe it would be right for me to go ahead and do that, right? I mean, people are going to think this way about the utilitarian calculation, and for most people, it's going to be pretty off. So then, if we do a utilitarian calculation, and now we're doing it right, of course, right? About other people doing it, we'll realize that it would have negative effects. If everybody out there was doing this, if everybody out there was thinking like a utilitarian, it wouldn't have good effects. So the way it should work instead is that maybe one or two people should think like utilitarians, and they should give everybody else some simple rules to follow all the time, like don't steal, don't cheat. Even though, let's say we're the ones, you and me, we're the ones who know how to calculate the highest happiness. But then we tell everybody else, oh, just follow these rules. Even though we know sometimes it would be better if someone stole. Sometimes it would be better if someone cheated. But we can't leave that calculation up to just anyone. It's only a few people could calculate that correctly. So now, by thinking like utilitarians, we've arrived at the conclusion to tell other people not to think like utilitarians. And meanwhile, there'll be other people who are telling us that utilitarianism is wrong while also secretly believing that it's right because they don't think that we are capable of calculating it out. And so the situation you end up with is, if everyone's following utilitarianism, then everyone's going around saying that utilitarianism is wrong. No, don't be a utilitarian. Follow these simple rules instead, to like everyone else or almost everyone else, while secretly believing that utilitarianism is right. And that just seems strange. Why would the correct moral system have this result that everyone needs to say it's not the correct moral system? Like it has to be kept a secret. It seems like a system of morality, something you should be able to share with everyone. Like, here's how we do the right thing. Like all the time, everyone could do this. But then it's kind of weird to have one that implies you keep it a secret from like most other people. Now, Mill actually addresses this problem, and many others have said similar things. His response is that this problem is not unique to utilitarianism. Any theory, unless it was just so simplistic as to be ridiculously oversimplified and for that reason incorrect, is going to have the result that some people would apply it incorrectly. Like anything else, utilitarianism will be a skill to apply, and so there will only be a few people who apply it in the best way. So then any other theory that is sophisticated at all would have the same, you'd have the same issue, that you'll be telling others to just apply these far simpler rules, whereas what's literally, truly correct is something that's more complicated, more sophisticated. So what's the big deal? Utilitarianism doesn't have like a special problem in this regard. Now let me present to you what I think is probably the most influential, most kind of convincing type of argument against utilitarianism. It's also the simplest kind of objection, the most straightforward and concrete. The argument is simply that utilitarianism is subject to counterexamples. A counterexample is a case where the theory has an incorrect implication. So where the theory says something is right, but it's just obvious that it's not right. So something that is wrong is obviously wrong in a way that's more obvious than the idea of increasing happiness is something good. And I should mention, when I'm bringing up counterexamples, that counterexamples can be hypothetical, and it still counts because the theory is supposed to be telling us like what right and wrong is by definition. So if it were true that utilitarianism is the very definition of what's right and what's wrong, it should work in any situation. It shouldn't matter if it's a hypothetical situation. So now let me give you a couple of examples and think about using utilitarianism in each of these cases and what it would recommend. I'll start with a couple examples where utilitarianism makes recommendations that seem perfectly fine, and so it seems like it works. So case A, you're standing by the side of some railroad tracks, and you see that there's a train coming down the tracks. Now further along the tracks, you notice a person that has been tied down to the tracks. Okay, so by no fault of their own, they're about to be run over by this train. You also notice that there's a lever near you which diverts the train from the track it's on off to a side track where it will do no harm. The person will be saved. It seems obvious that you should pull the lever and send the train off along the side track where it won't harm the person. And that's the utilitarian thing, and it also seems right. This is perfectly acceptable consequence of the theory. It shows you how utilitarianism is capable of generating an obligation to do something where inaction would be wrong. And this comports well with our intuitions about right and wrong. Sometimes if you don't act, that could be just as bad as doing something that's bad. So that makes sense. Yeah, and now consider another case, case B, where if you pull the lever, then the train would go off and kill someone who it otherwise wouldn't kill. That seems obviously wrong, and utilitarianism seems to have that implication too. So utilitarianism can generate an obligation to do something. It can also generate an obligation not to do that very same thing, depending on the circumstances. In case A, one less person would die because of your action, so that makes it the right thing to do. But in case B, if you did the thing, if you did the very same thing, then one more person would die, which explains why you shouldn't do that thing according to utilitarianism. So now consider a third case, case C, where again the train is barreling down the track, and in this case it's going to run over a person, and your only potential input into this situation is to pull this lever which sends it off on a sidetrack. But this time, if you send it off on that sidetrack, there's 5 people tied down to the sidetrack, so that by your action of pulling the lever, it would actually kill 4 more people than it was going to kill to start with. This is another case where utilitarianism seems to do fine. It seems to say, no, you should absolutely not pull the lever because more people will die as a result of that. So it's better to, unfortunately, just there isn't anything you can do about the one person who's going to be run over by the train, right? Because you pull the lever and it's going to go kill 5 people instead, so you can't do anything. But now consider a case D, in which if the train goes straight, it's going to run over and kill 5 people. If you pull the lever, then those 5 people will be saved because it goes off on the sidetrack. But then on the sidetrack, there is one person who's tied to that track, and they will be run over and killed by the train. Now it seems like in this case utilitarianism is starting to look a little less good, because the same thing is true as was true in case C. The only difference is that this time you act, right? If you pull the lever, 4 fewer people will die, right? In case C, if you pulled the lever, 4 more people would die, and so it's clearly you shouldn't pull the lever. But you pull the lever, 4 fewer people will die. But one will die as a direct result of your action. Now, many people have kind of an intuitive reaction that that's not the same as case C. But can utilitarianism make sense of it not being the same? Since utilitarianism just weighs up the consequences, like 5 people dying is worse than 1 person dying. It doesn't seem like the fact that you had input into the situation should really matter according to utilitarianism, right? If the right thing to do in case C, if the utilitarian thing to do, was to not pull the lever, watch the train go by, and run over 1 person, because if the only thing you could do would be worse, running over 5 people, well, then that seems to apply that it's equally utilitarian to pull the lever when that results in 1 person dying instead of 5 people dying. The moral status of pulling the lever, which results in the person dying, is exactly equal to the moral status of not pulling the lever and just watching the train go by, where unfortunately it kills 1 person. And you might think that those two actions are not equal, but it also gets worse. Consider another case, case E, wherein you're, instead of standing next to a railroad track watching a train come along and there's a lever there, you're standing up on a platform and you're watching this trolley come into a station from above. It's below you. And then you notice that the trolley is slowing down, but there are 5 people that are tied to the track below through no fault of their own again. And the trolley is just still going fast enough that it will barely run over all 5 of these people and kill them. And you are thinking, if only there was some heavy object that I could throw down in front of this trolley, that would be enough to stop the trolley, because it's a relatively lightweight trolley and it's coming to a stop already. And then you notice that 10 feet away from you is a very, very fat man. He's looking down at the situation the same way you are. And in this example, you are a highly accomplished engineer and you have a fantastic sense of physical weight of people by looking at them and how their body mass would affect trolleys that are starting to slow down. So you know that if you were to just give this fat man a push over the railing where he would fall down onto the track, and that would be enough to stop the trolley. He would be run over and crushed, but in the process it would stop this lightweight trolley so that it would save these other 5 people. Now, does that seem like it would be the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, to push this guy down onto the train tracks? Utilitarianism seems to imply that it is, and not only that, but it's exactly the same as cases C or D. The action that sacrifices 1 life in exchange for 5 seems to be recommended by utilitarianism. But now the objection goes, it's obviously wrong to push this guy down in front of the train, forcing him to make a sacrifice, whether he wants to or not. But utilitarianism doesn't take into account whether the person wants to sacrifice themselves or not. It only matters that more people will be saved if you force the sacrifice. And it seems like it's obviously not right to push this guy in front of the train, or at the very least, it seems like it's not equal to those other choices. So if that's right, then utilitarianism just implies that something that's just straightforwardly obvious that it's wrong. So that means that utilitarianism can't be the whole story behind morality. It doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be a factor. Now, that's not necessarily the final word on this objection. There are many things that utilitarians would try to say to defend the theory against it. You could also dig deeper on a lot of these objections that I've brought up. There are other objections that you could discuss, and lots more that could be said about utilitarianism. In any case, at this point, it seems like we've covered the bases as far as utilitarianism goes. The main aspects, key points, what the theory says, some pros and some cons, and a few diversions along the way as far as creating variations on the theory. So I hope you find this helpful.